Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here tonight. Let's see. She wants me to test the microphone. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Everybody here okay? Yeah. Okay. That's great. We're happy to see so many friends of mine who have been listening to our program over the years. How many have heard our Those Were the Days radio show? Oh my gosh. You know, that's half of the talk. I don't have to do any selling now at all. That's wonderful. That's right. From Evanston. Yeah, we started, you know, 34 years we've been doing this. 34 years with all the old-time radio shows. And we did start at a little station in Evanston. It was a 1,000-watt daytime radio station. It was on from sunrise to sunset. And you couldn't hear the station if you lived south of Madison Street in the Chicago area. But it did go all the way out about 2 miles into Lake Michigan. So if you were, you know, swimming out that way, you could hear us. And we started on May the 2nd of 1970. And it was a beautiful sunny afternoon in May. And the Cubs were playing. And who was listening to the radio? You know, we didn't think anybody was listening to the radio. I figured the only people listening to the radio would be my wife and my mother and father. Well, I was sure about my mother and father anyway, but we started, and we had no response. But we did. I played some old-time radio shows. We were on for 3 hours, from 1 until 4 at that time, and interrupted by news and sports from the mutual broadcasting system every half an hour or something like that. So if we had a half-hour radio show to play, we had to stop it at 1:30, for example, and then do 5 minutes of news, and then pick up the second half of the radio show and then go along. But as we moved along, there started to be some listeners who came in. And the station said, let's get rid of the news and let's get rid of the sports, and you can do 3 hours without interruption. And wow, that was great to be able to just go through that way. And finally, one day I was over-planned on the program. And I had too much material for the 3 hours. And the clock was coming up to 4 o'clock. And I had a good 15 minutes of this old-time show that was a half an hour long, 15 minutes left to play. So I thought, well, it wasn't just exactly that day. Some days I was over 3 minutes and I went over until 4:03. And then a few weeks later I go to 4:05 and then 4:07. Now I'm 15 minutes over. So I thought, well, let's do it. Unbeknownst to me, the manager of the station had come in and gone into his office sometime during the broadcast, but that was down the hall, and I was in the studio. So now we finished the program about 14 minutes after 4, and then signed off, and they went to whatever music or whatever it was coming on to there, and I thought, oh, well. And all of a sudden, the door to the studio opens up, and here the manager is standing there. And I thought, this was my last program now. This is it. And he said, pointed his finger at me, he says, that's okay. That's great. You want to go on? If you need more time than 4 o'clock, stay on. Because we were getting audience. We were getting audience. So shortly after that, then we went on till 5 o'clock. And we've been on Saturday afternoons from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock for 34 years. That's been our prime time for old-time radio.
With the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty Hi-Yo Silver, the Lone Ranger. With his faithful faithful Indian companion Tonto, the daring and resourceful masked rider of the plains, led the fight for law and order in the early western United States. Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. From out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of the great horse Silver. The Lone Ranger rides again. Come on, Silver. Let's go, big fella. I'm Silver. Hooray!
Boy, those were the days. Those are the days. We used to listen to the Lone Ranger. Now, in the Chicago area, the Lone Ranger was on at 6:30 in the evening, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights. And boy, oh boy, my father would come home from work about a minute before 6 o'clock. And he expected, of course, to have dinner on the table at 6 o'clock. And it was. And so we'd all, this is something they hardly do today anymore, but the family, my brother and I, and my mother and father would have dinner together every night on the wooden table in the kitchen. And by 6:30 we were through, and my brother and I would run into the living room and get on the floor in front of that Zenith console radio. Oh, man. And we would tune into the Lone Ranger. And by 7 o'clock, when the program was over, with all that Western action, I swear that there was a layer of dust on the carpeting about 1/4 of an inch thick all through the house. When I was a kid, I heard something terrible and traumatic about the Lone Ranger. I had heard that the Lone Ranger had died, and that he had died in an automobile accident. Now, what was the Lone Ranger doing in an automobile? Well, what happened was the actor, a man by the name of Earl Grazier, who portrayed the Lone Ranger, was in an auto accident, and he did indeed lose his life in that auto accident. Now, this was a very, very popular program. And so the producers of the program, which were at radio station WXYZ in Detroit, said, we've got to replace him. And they needed a different actor to come in and take over the role. But now the listening audience was very keenly tuned in to the voices on radio. And so they said, we have to have a transition period for a week or 2 weeks of programs. They revised the script so that the Lone Ranger was very seriously ill. So ill, in fact, that he couldn't speak. And so for those 2 weeks, all we heard was the Lone Ranger's heavy breathing as Tonto nursed him back to health. And then, with Brace Beamer in the role of the Lone Ranger, Hi-Yo Silver, he roared again. And it was a great show. We loved it week after week, day in and day out. It was just a great program. And you know, in the radio days, there was a different kind of writing for an audience that didn't have anything but the sounds to hear. We had to make up our own pictures to go with all of this. Now we don't sit and watch the television and see all the pictures made up for us. You saw everything in your mind's eye. And so there was a lot of descriptions going on. I mean, even if the Lone Ranger was riding along the range by himself without his faithful Indian companion Tonto, he would be saying, come on, big fella, we've got to head him off at the pass. I mean, he's talking to the horse. But he's telling us, the listener, what was going on. And in some radio programs, the action was, there was a man walking into a house, not the Lone Ranger necessarily, but in another mystery show. A man is walking into a house, and he's by himself. But he says, let's see, I'll get my key out. And you hear a little jingle of keys. And I'll turn the key in the door. Oh, the door's up. Gee, it's dark in here. I'll turn on the light. You hear a little like that. He's talking to himself. I'm going to walk down the hallway now. Gee, it seems awfully dark in here. Let me go. Oh, well, I think I'll go into the den. And oh, it's dark in the den too. He bumps into a little chair or something. Oh, I bumped into a chair. Where's the light? Oh, here's the light switch. Turn the light switch. And he says, oh, what's that over there by the desk? He says, it's a body. Now, all along, he's by himself, and he's describing all of this, and we didn't think anything of it because we were there. We were so intent. We were listening to this. He had reached out from behind that flickering green eye on the radio and grabbed us and said, this is what it is. These are the pictures you're going to see for the next hour. Sometimes it didn't work. Back to the Lone Ranger now. One piece of dialogue, and I don't know which Lone Ranger program it was, but the crooks are hiding out and waiting to ambush the Lone Ranger. And you hear some horses' hoofbeats in the distance. And one of the crooks, probably a member of the Butch Cavendish gang, turned to the other and he said, "Listen, I hear a white horse coming." It was great stuff. It was great stuff. Now, many people will remember where they were during a traumatic national or international event. And a big, important, probably the first biggest important national, international event in my life happened on a Sunday when I was listening to my favorite radio show on a Sunday afternoon, and they interrupted to talk about the bombing in Pearl Harbor. And I always remember that I was there in the living room, on the floor, in front. I never sat in the living room, always on the floor in front of that radio. I want to be right close up, see, listening to this, my favorite show. Lamont Cranston, who traveled to it was 4 o'clock in Chicago. The Shadow was on at 4 o'clock in Chicago. It was 5 o'clock in the East. They used to call him the 5 o'clock Shadow in New York. Too many Burma shave signs, I think. Lamont Cranston learned a secret in the Orient, and he had the ability to cloud men's minds. He learned those hypnotic powers to cloud man's minds so that the crooks he was after could not see him, though he was in the room with them. And the only person who knew that the voice of the invisible shadow belonged to Lamont Cranston, wealthy young man about town, was his constant friend and companion, the lovely Margot Lane. Oh boy, this is going to be a real short program tonight. This is Margot Lane, the lovely Margot Lane. It was great. And now Margot Lane, I would say, the Shadow, an early actor to play the Shadow was Orson Welles. Even while he was scaring the daylights out of half the country with the War of the Worlds broadcast. And opposite Orson Welles, as the lovely Margot Lane, was Agnes Moorehead. Now, Agnes Moorehead, she did a lot of work with Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater and on the radio, and of course, she was known as the first lady of suspense. But later, she was what? Samantha's mother on the Bewitched TV series. Yeah, I don't know if she had that flaming red hair when she was working with the Shadow. You know.
Wasn't she the one who was in the program Sorry Wrong Number?
Yes, he asked if Agnes Moorehead did Sorry Wrong Number, right, on Suspense. It was like a one-woman show almost. She did it 8 times over the 20 years of Suspense. And it is as powerful a piece of radio drama as you will ever find. Agnes Moorehead. Now, there was a little soft light behind the dial of the radio. And up on the top of the dial was a little green eye. That flickering green eye of radio. And what you had to do was you used the knob on there to tune the green eye for the best fidelity you could get. And if you were over here, if you were out of tune, you would have a big pie-shaped wedge in that green eye. But as you tuned it in finer, you would bring it close so that it almost touched, not overlapped, but almost touched. And as it almost touching, your radio was set for the greatest entertainment there could possibly be. My brother and I would be in the living room on the floor in front of that radio. My parents might be in the living room with us. We all listened to the same things. My mother would be at the end of the sofa, darning socks. Remember? darning socks? You had a hole in your sock. You sewed it shut, right? Today you have a hole in the sock, you throw the sock out, right? My father would be in the easy chair reading the newspaper or a magazine, and we'd all be listening to the programs. Now, when certain mystery programs came on, we turned the lights out. The only lights that were on in our living room was the soft light and the flickering green eye of that Zenith radio. And the light at the base of the floor lamp, casting giant shadows on the imitation lace curtains we had on the windows. And we were ready for I Love a Mystery, the adventures of Jack, Doc, and Reggie of the A1 Detective Agency, solving the mystery of the thing that cries in the night. Or we tuned into Lights Out, Everybody. Art Schobler had this program. He told you to turn the lights out. Whoa, we love that. And he says, turn out your lights. And if you don't think that you can stand the mystery that's to come, we respectfully invite you to turn off your radio now. So we were ready. We were ready. Oh, we had tales well calculated to keep us in suspense. And the one that we always liked, the best of all, was when they opened the creaking door of the Inner Sanctum.
Good evening, friends. This is your host to welcome you through the creaking door into the Inner Sanctum. Come in, come in. I've been reading my fan mail. Huh? Oh, sure, I get lots of it. Delivered in a hearse every morning. One lonely heart writes, despite your sinister voice, you strike me as a fine gentleman and a homebody. I am companionable, good-natured, unmarried, and I've been hardly dead a year. Won't you please exchange photographs, signed, Lonesome. Did somebody say the lady spook out of turn?
Oh man, when that came on. And you know, the thing about those programs, we had to provide all the visuals. We costumed the actors, we decorated the sets. The hero could be as tall and as virile and good looking as we wanted him to be. The heroine as soft and as beautiful and as blonde as she could possibly be. Man, it was just great stuff. It was so good. And we remember people who listened to these programs back in those golden days of radio, hearing some of them again on my broadcasts over the past 30-some years, will say to me, you know, I actually remember hearing that program before, and I remember everything about it. It scared the daylights out of me. But you see, what can be better than your imagination? Radio is a participatory sport. Television, spectator sport. And no laugh tracks in radio. Never had a laugh track in radio. Whenever you heard somebody laughing, an audience uproariously responding to a gag, it's because the gag was funny and the audience was genuinely amused by it. Television, if the audience doesn't laugh, it doesn't matter. They turn up a knob and everybody is hysterical. You've heard it a million times watching those shows. So nothing better than the radio days. Well, speaking of the radio days, and speaking of comedy, there were some great comedy shows on. And one of them got their start in the Chicago area when Jim and Marion Jordan came up from their home in Peoria, Illinois. And they started working at, I think it was WENR in Chicago. And they were part of, and they did some work on WMAQ. And they were on a program called Carlton Meyer's Kindergarten, which was a children's show way back in the very early 30s. They were on a program called The Smith Family. They did some character voices and things on a program called Smack Out. And then the Johnson's Wax Company of Racine, Wisconsin was looking for a 30-minute situation comedy program to sell Johnson's Wax. And so they got Jim and Marion Jordan and a writer by the name of Don Quinn to come up with a program called Fibber McGee and Molly. And they sold Johnson's Wax and Johnson's Carnu and all kinds of stuff to millions and millions of people for, they started in 1935 and they went off the air about 1959 with regular programming this whole period of time. And I had the great joy and the great pleasure of meeting Jim Jordan and talking with him, and in fact even working with him for a while in a special series we did. But Jim had told me that when they first started, the advertising agency and Johnson's Wax said, we want you to do this for 13 weeks, which was the normal cycle of programming, and those are 13 weeks renewable for 26 again for till 39 weeks for a year. And this was a big break for them because now they'd be on the network. And Jim Jordan said to me, no. I told them no. We didn't want to do it for 13 weeks. They were to start in May, and 13 weeks would take them right into smack into the middle of the summer, and they didn't think they had a chance because the audiences were lighter in the summer. People going out to the beach, spending time outdoors. So this was pretty gutsy of him to do that, to pass up, to say, no, I'm not interested in a big deal like this. And they said, all right, we'll give you 26 weeks. He said, okay, we'll do 26 weeks. So they signed him up for 26 weeks, and that 26 weeks was parlayed into all those years, something like 20-some years on radio. And they came into their home. We came into their home at 79 Wistful Vista. Remember that? And the doorbell rang, and Harlow Wilcox would come in, and he'd talk about Johnson's Wax, and the old-timer and Merrill Trivia would be in there, and Doc Gamble, and Beulah the maid. Fibber McGee didn't have any visible means of support, yet he had a maid working for him. It didn't make any difference. And in fact, when they started the program, they didn't even have a house. Johnson's Wax wanted them to sell Carnu, the auto polish. And so they had a rickety old car, and they were traveling. Every week they would travel from one place to the next, and of course then they'd do a commercial for the car wax. But they finally decided that they should have a home. And now where did this couple who didn't have anything at all, how are they going to buy a home? Well, they bought a raffle ticket and won the house at 79 Wistful Vista. Now what did that house have in it? A closet. Fibber McGee's hall closet, right? And it was so jam-packed with stuff that whenever somebody accidentally or purposely opened that hall closet, everything come collapsing out, crashing, bang, boom, and the audience loved it at home, and the audience in the studio was in for a real treat because they had, they saw all this noise that was being made with all the pots and pans and bowling pins and everything else. What they had was a series of stairs, think about this wide, maybe this wide. And they had a bunch of stairs up here, and on these stairs, these steps, were piled all this pots and pans and different things like that. And the sound man would start at the bottom. And he'd knock the stuff off the bottom step, then the second step, and it would fall on each other, and bang, 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 until it would all crash down. And he had a little bell at the end, tinkle, 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 tinkle. And what would Fibber say every week? Got to straighten out that closet one of these days. Now, over the years, I've talked to a lot of people. I've been so happy to introduce young people to the old radio shows. And they hear a Fibber McGee and Molly program on our broadcast. And they hear the closet gag. And they say, so that's where that came from. For years, my mother said to me, your room looks like Fibber McGee's closet. You ought to clean out underneath your bed. It looks like Fibber McGee's closet, they say. And that's where it came from. Jim and Marion Jordan were terrific. And the interview that I had with Jim in his home, sitting in his living room in Beverly Hills with one microphone between us, and we just sat there and talked for, I don't know, maybe 45 or 50 minutes about the radio days, how the closet gag happened, and all of these other things. Well, that interview is in our book. speaking of radio. But let's listen to the folks at 79 Wistful Vista for a minute.
The Johnson's Wax Program with Fibber McGee and Molly. Johnson's Wax Products for Home and Industry present Fibber McGee and Molly with Bill Thompson, Gail Gordon, Arthur Q. Bryan, and me, Harlow Wilcox.
You know, I can just see Mr. Wilcox, if his house ever catches fire, getting his Johnson's Wax out of the house and then going back after his wife.
Yeah, he reminds me of the way my pop used to be about a job he had when me and him worked at the popcorn works in Peoria.
McGee, you never told me about working at the popcorn works.
I never mentioned the job Pop and I had at the Peoria Pop and Popcorn plant.
You never did.
Well, boy, I will. You see, Pop was head popcorn popper at the Peoria Pop and Popcorn plant, and I used to love to watch Pop pop popcorn. Because Pop was a pip with a popcorn popper, and the popcorn he popped was popcorn plus. I worked over in the pop department myself, see, and every afternoon I'd pop into the popcorn department with a pitcher full of pop for Pop. And we'd sit there popping popcorn by the popperful, poking it into our pussies and pushing it down with a pitcher of pop, so Pop and I were almost pooped from the pop. Popping the popcorn, pouring the pop, poking the popcorn, pushing the pop, poking the pit and the popcorn down.
You see how much that audience then and now appreciated that great? That takes a lot of work, boy, and a lot of concentration to do something like that. Jim and Marion Jordan, they were great. They were almost always in the top 10 of the ratings in the radio days, bouncing back and forth a little bit with Jack Benny and Bob Hope and the Lux Radio Theater. Remember, Lux presents Hollywood, yeah. Oh, what a show that was, too. There was another comedian on radio who was considered to be a comedian's comedian. He was very good. He wrote a lot of his own material, and people always waited for him to take that stroll down Allen's Alley. I'm talking about Fred Allen, right?
Gosh, Portland, it's good to be back in Allen's Alley. Well, let's see what Titus Moody is up to tonight.
Howdy, Bob.
Say, Mr. Moody, you look shorter tonight.
First time I ever wore a union suit and stockings.
Well, what makes you look shorter?
It's trying to keep up my stockings.
Your stockings?
Yeah. This little door hangs down on the back of the union suit. And when I button that door onto my stockings,
Yes?
it pulls me down 6 inches.
Time. Well, Mr. Moody, what do you think about Mayor LaGuardia leaving office?
Why, he's been a good mayor, what there is of him.
Well, what kind of work do you think he should go in for?
He'd be a good man on a farm, Bub.
Well, how do you mean?
He's the only man I know that can milk a cow standing up.
Tell me, Mr. Moody, do you think the mayor is sorry to go?
Oh, I know just how he feels, Bub.
You do, huh?
Yeah, I used to be mayor in my town.
You were the mayor?
Yeah, but I wasn't no LaGuardia.
You mean,
After working around the farm for 30 years,
yes?
I didn't smell like no little flower.
Now, the interesting thing about Fred Allen, he dealt a lot in topical humor, as you could tell from this. And when you listen to it 40 or 50 years after the fact, you have to have a sense of history, or at least popular culture of the era. And I talk occasionally to college students or high school students or people who are far too young to have been there listening to those programs. And they say, well, what? I didn't get all of that. Well, first of all, Fiorello LaGuardia, as we all know, was the mayor of New York City. And he was a short man. And Fiorello is Italian for little flower, see? So a short man, he had to milk a cow sitting on a, standing up or something like that, and he smelled like a little, didn't smell like no little flower, he said. So you have to, but when you explain it, you know, it's, and when I was a kid listening to some of this stuff, I don't think I got a lot of those gags, but I loved listening to Fred Allen because I enjoyed the rhythm of the humor, the rhythm of the lines. They just did it. I mean, Bob Hope, when he would do his shows from the servicemen's camps, he would be talking about a lot of stuff happening in the camp. And out there, and he'd talk about Simmons Corners or some kind of a place in town. Everybody, audience would laugh because the GIs knew it was a hangout or something like that. People across the country had no idea, but it was Bob's delivery and the rhythm and the response to the audience. You had a laugh at home. And of course, that I think is what makes all these people think that the soundtrack laugh is important, except there's nothing there to laugh at. Of course, Fred Allen had a feud with somebody who was on radio. Fred was on Sunday nights for a long time, and so was Jack Benny. And Jack Benny probably holds up better than any other radio comedian of all the years. Now, I'm not going to take a thing away from Fibber and Molly, because I truly loved Fibber McGee and Molly. And I used to resent it as a kid on Tuesday nights when Fibber and Molly were on, and they were interrupted by the King's Men singing a number, and then a little later by Billy Mills in the orchestra doing a musical number. And hey, you know, I wanted this to keep going. But now as I listen to those shows, I realize what great musicians those people were, and they really brought a lot of spark into it. And Fibber and Molly, by the way, and most of these people knew when to stop. Fibber and Molly did not open that hall closet every week. They opened it a lot, but not every week. And so many of the other comedians had a good, funny gag line, but they wouldn't use it every week. Now, Jack Benny, of course, he had 1 million of them. I mean, he was a stingy guy. He was cheap. He was vain. And he owned a car that was so old it was being held together by rubber bands and whatever was passing for Scotch tape at that time. And his persona carried it away, and Jack rarely had any gags. He did not have gags. All the gags, all the punchlines were in the hands of his crew. Dennis Day, Mary Livingston, Phil Harris, all of those people. They had the gags mostly at Jack's expense because he was a vain and he was, you know, all of these things. And you didn't even have to explain to the audience. You just kind of set it out there, like this.
The Lucky Strike program, starring Jack Benny, with Mary Livingston, Phil Harris, Rochester, Dennis Day, and yours truly, Don Wilson. Yes, sir, I'm getting to be a pretty good barber. I'd better take a little more off this side. And a little more off this side. And a wisp off the top. Say, that looks pretty good now.
Oh, hello, Rochester. What are you doing?
Just cutting your hair, boss. Put it on. Let's see how it looks.
You see? Now you knew that, right? You knew Rochester was cutting a wig because it couldn't be anything different. Jack was so predictable. When a hold-up man held him up and said, "Your money or your life," there was long silence. And the audience was laughing already before Jack delivered the line, "I'm thinking it over." It was just genius. Jack Benny is so popular today. It's the most popular thing we broadcast on our program. In fact, we devote the month of February every year, which was February 14th was Jack Benny's birthday. And we celebrate it as Jack Benny's birthday for the whole month in February, playing mostly Jack Benny programs from a long, long career, 1932 until 1955, 23 years on radio. Sunday nights after the first year or so. And can't get enough of Jack Benny. He's just so funny, and it holds up so well, especially when he goes for violin lessons from Professor LeBlanc, you know, or he has to go down to the vault. He goes down to the vault, you know, and the alligators are snapping at his feet. And turns the dial of the combination, and the sirens go off, and the vault guard, who never sees the light of day, says, "Tell me, Mr. Benny, how is Mr. Lincoln these days?" You know, that's wonderful. There was a different kind of radio going on during the day, because in those days of the golden age of radio, the women were all working at home. They were not working in outside of the house. They were working at home, taking care of their family, doing the things for the family. And you would listen to the soap operas, the daytime dramas. And they were 15-minute stories, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And they were on one after another from around 9 or 9:30 in the morning until around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Boom, 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 one right after another. And you'd listen to these stories and you'd get caught up into them. And boy, you were really a part of it. And this helped the daytime audience, which were the women at home. And they had a routine. Monday was wash day. Tuesday was ironing day. Wednesday was mending day. Wednesday night was darning the socks night. Thursday was something else. Friday something else. And they were doing this listening to the radio. And their day would go by quickly as they listened to all the trials and tribulations of the romance of Helen Trent. This is a woman who sought out to prove that she could find love and happiness even though she was 35.
Oh my goodness.
She proved that life would not be over at 35. We had Lorenzo Jones and his wife Belle. Lorenzo was a character to the town, but not to his wife Belle, who loved him. We had young Widder Brown. We had our gal Sunday, a girl from a little mining town out west who found happiness with rich and handsome Lord Henry Brinthorpe, who was Superman on another network. One after another, these shows would come on. Now, I never listened to these programs, except if I had a cold or I was sick from school. And if I had to stay home, I can't talk, like sore throat. My mother would say, okay, you're going to stay home. I want you to take a teaspoon of tonsilline. Tonsilline was a yellowy liquid in a long bottle that was embossed with the neck of a giraffe on it. A giraffe had a long neck, see, so you would say tonsilline for the neck. So my mother would give me a spoonful of tonsilline, and it was ghastly. It was terrible. Oh, it would never fake that you were sick if there was a threat of tonsilline. Now, my mother she had one spoon in the house for tonsilline. And castor oil, too. I think we had castor oil, which was worse. And she poured the tonsilline into the spoon, and I would take it in that spoon. And that spoon, which she got, it was a souvenir from the Chicago World's Fair.
Oh, God.
And it had a little stuff on there, and it was black. It had turned black. That's what the tonsilline was doing to this spoon, and she was feeding that to me. But she gave me the tonsilline. And she said, now you're going to stay home today. You're not going to read comic books. You're not going to play on the floor in the kitchen underneath the stove, because we had a stove on legs, right? With the oven up here and all that, convenient up here, because where I had my toy soldiers underneath there. So you're going to go in bed. You're going to rest and relax. But you can listen to the radio. Now, we never had our radio in the bedroom, but there was a little bed table, and she put a radio there for me, the radio that used to be on the top of the refrigerator. We had one little table model on the refrigerator in the kitchen, and then the Zenith in the living room. And you can listen to the radio. So I would listen, and I'd hear Happy Hank in the morning, and I would hear Uncle Mel telling some stories. Hear Don McNeil in the Breakfast Club.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe Breakfast in Hollywood with Tom Brenneman. And then the soap operas would start. And I'd listen to one after another all day long. And you know, you could get caught up into these things. I mean, they gave you a 5-minute recap of what had happened before, then they gave you a 5-minute story, and then they told you for 5 minutes what's going to happen the next time. And in between, they were telling you all about Rinso and Oxidol and Super Suds and all of this stuff. And so it was amazing. So I usually survived the day and went to school the next day. And very rarely I was home 2 days. But most of the time I was all set and I go back to school. And I wouldn't have a sore throat again for 3 or 4 months maybe. And the same routine, tonsilline, get into bed, no comic books, no toys, listen to the radio. And I turned on the radio and you know, I could pick up these soap operas almost exactly where I left them 3 months earlier.
to Doll's own Ma Perkins. And now for Ma Perkins. Well, is Ma going to learn the truth about the cousins at last? Yes, Ma told Shuffle that she would ask some questions about the matter of Sylvester denying that he took Willie's and Evie's money. We know that Sylvester did take that money, and Shuffle is sure of it, but Sylvester lied to Ma about it, and that's what Ma has promised to find out.
It took Ma 9 months to find out about that. There was one lady on that program who was expecting a baby for 2.5 years. It was amazing. But that was daytime radio. So now we talked about nighttime radio and daytime radio, but there was one more radio time. The best of all was after-school radio. Oh, we'd come racing home after school to listen to Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy. Have you tried Wheaties, the best breakfast food in the land? Terry and the Pirates, Quaker Puff Wheat Sparkies, shot from guns. Tennessee Jed, got 'em Tennessee, dead center. We had the Tom Mix Ralston straight shooters are on the air. Shredded Ralston for your breakfast starts the day off shining bright. Man, oh man, all this stuff. We played a whole Saturday of Tom Mix programs last week on our show, man. You had all these after-school shows. Look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. Brought to you by Kellogg's Pep, the super delicious cereal. One of the great things about Kellogg's Pep was they packaged the premium in the box of cereal. Everything else you had to send away for, secret decoders and shake-up mugs and all kinds of things, magnifying glasses and glow-in-the-dark rulers and glow-in-the-dark belts and But Pep packaged the stuff in the cereal. They had little pins that you'd put on your Jughead beanie and had pictures of the comic strip characters on them. One in every box of cereal. Now suppose you got 2 Winnie Winkles. Well, you would trade one of those Winnie Winkles for a Skippy. And it was great. Or during the war, they packaged in Kellogg's Pep miniature light balsa wood airplane model airplanes. And on the back of the package, they had the silhouettes of enemy bombers. You had a Japanese Zero or a German Messerschmitt. And we'd take the back panel of the box of Kellogg's Pep and we'd sit on a little hill in a prairie. Now, a prairie was a vacant lot in your block. And we'd sit there and we'd look skyward, waiting for a Messerschmitt or a Zero to come by. Every once in a while, we'd see an airplane and we'd check. No, it couldn't be. God knows what we would have done if we ever saw a Messerschmitt flying over. So we had to have the cereal. But Kellogg's Pep was not the greatest tasting cereal. So in our pantry, a walk-in pantry, we had a row of opened but uneaten boxes of Kellogg's Pep, standing behind a row of open but uneaten jars of Ovaltine. We had to have Ovaltine.
That's right.
Oh, Ovaltine. Now I can tell you, within a couple of years, how old you are if you tell me you listened to Orphan Annie.
Oh, yeah.
You did, Orphan Annie, yeah. You're older then, because Orphan Annie was on in the 30s and Captain Midnight was on in the 40s, both sponsored by Ovaltine. Now you had to get all these things. You had to get the secret decoders, Orphan Annie secret decoders or Captain Midnight secret decoder. Not a decoder pin, it wasn't or a ring. It wasn't a decoder ring, it was a pin. And they changed it every year. So you're listening to the story, and Captain Midnight says to his sidekick, Chuck, I love that his name was Chuck, talking to his sidekick, Chuck, and he says, Chuck, Ivan Shark has decoded our messages. He now has this, he knows the code to all the secret messages we've been sending. And Chuck says, gosh, Captain Midnight, what are we going to do about it? Don't worry, Chuck, says Captain Midnight, because now we have a new 1944 secret decoder. Egads, I had the old 43 decoder. I guess they needed to sell more Ovaltine, so I sent in 2 inner seal rings from 2 jars of Ovaltine, along with 10 cents in coin or stamp, and mailed it on Tuesday to Captain Midnight, Box 1, Chicago, Illinois. And on Wednesday, I was waiting for the mailman to come with my 1944 secret decoder, with the accompanying manual and the how to decipher the code. Not on Wednesday. Didn't come on Thursday or Friday, and I'm getting crazy. Finally, I'm meeting the mailman at the corner of the block. Get away, kid, you bother me. Finally, one day, the mailman comes with a package for Charles Schaden from the Wander Company, Villa Park, Illinois. I sent to Chicago to Ovaltine, but I got it from one. Okay. I grabbed the package, I raced into my room, I closed the door, and I opened up the package, and there was my 1944 secret decoder. And the manual telling me how to set the decoder to decode the messages that announcer Pierre Andre gave us at the end of every Captain Midnight broadcast. That day, when it was time for Captain Midnight, I was ready. I had my Indian chief pad, you know, from school. And I had 3 very well sharpened pencils all ready. In case I broke one, I'd be ready for the call. And there at the end of the Captain Midnight message, the Captain Midnight program, the message is there. Pierre Andre says, okay, gang, members of the secret squadron, set your code at A equals 21, 14, 9, 17, 22, 3, 15. Got that? Happy landing. He'd zoom off, and I'd zoom off into my room. I go in the room, close the door, close the blinds, take out my flashlight, looked at the pad, and took out my decoder, and I decoded the message. And it said, drink Ovaltine.
Captain Midnight brought to you every day, Monday through Friday, with the makers of Ovaltine, America's favorite food drink. Now, have you heard the news? The news about that marvelous new 2-piece, bright-colored shake-up mug Captain Midnight has for you? That big, handsome, 2-in-1 shaker-upper you use to make ice-cold, chocolatey shake-ups to drink every day? Well, sir, Captain Midnight has one for you almost as a gift. And listen, it's something we'll want to send in for tonight, for sure.
I sent in for one. I had them all. And that shake-up mug, you know what the deal was? You'd pour milk in the mug, and then you'd put in a heaping teaspoon of Ovaltine, which didn't sink. I mean, Ovaltine sat there on the top of the milk. You know, and what you had to do, so they give you the cap, you put the cap on, and then you shake it up, like later, and it was good practice for mixing a martini. Shaken, not stirred, yeah. And then you'd open it up, and the Ovaltine would be swirling around in there, but it hadn't dissolved. It never dissolved. It never. And you drink it, and it was terrible. You liked it. I got a half a dozen jars yet at home. 1944. One more sound from the great radio days for you. And it started at radio station WEBH in Chicago at the Edgewater Beach Hotel, EBH. Freeman Gosden and Charles Correll were working on that radio station. Then they moved over to WGN, where they developed 2 characters, 2 black characters for radio, but these were white men. They developed 2 characters known as Sam and Henry. Sam and Henry became very popular. In fact, they were so popular that the Chicago Tribune had a comic strip called Sam and Henry. And it was very popular. People listened to Sam and Henry all the time. Well, then Gosden and Carell wanted to be able to be heard in markets beyond Chicago. And WGN it was a big station, had a big powerful signal, but it couldn't be heard coast to coast. Now they knew, Gosden and Carell, that WMAQ was soon going to be affiliated with the Columbia Broadcasting System. This was long before WMAQ became NBC. It was early on. And so they thought, gee, if we could go over to WMAQ, then all of a sudden we'll be able to be heard coast to coast. So they made a deal with WMAQ to be broadcasting on their station, and then when CBS came on board very shortly, they would be heard from coast to coast. But they had to end their affiliation with WGN, which at that time was located in the Drake Hotel in Chicago, at the top of the Drake Hotel. So Gosden and Carell went to the management offices of WGN. They got in the elevator at the main floor of the Drake, and they rode up to the top, and they went into WGN offices and talked to the manager and told them what they wanted to do and where they were going to go. And the manager said, well, we hate to lose you, but if you feel you have to do that, you can go ahead and do it. They didn't really have a contract as such. But the management said, you cannot, of course, take the names Sam and Henry with you. Well, why not? He said, well, because they're copyrighted. We've got a comic strip in the Tribune now, and we copyrighted those names, and they belong to us. Well, Freeman Gosden and Charles Carell thought about this a little bit and said, well, okay, we'll have to change the names then. Be the same type characters, but we'll change the names. So they figured, as they left the management offices of WGN at the top of the Drake, they pressed the buzzer for the elevator. In those days, the elevators had people driving them, you know. And they got in. And as they're descending, they noticed that they're trying to figure, well, what could we call this? And they noticed that the elevator operator was a man they'd seen many times in the Drake Hotel, and his name was Amos. Didn't register anything, but until they got to the main floor and the doors opened and they stepped out into the lobby, and there was a fellow mopping up the lobby floor, another man they'd seen for many years, and they knew him as Andy. And the light bulb, you know, went off, and it said Amos and Andy. And Amos and Andy they became, and they became radio's all-time favorites. They were so popular that movie theaters advertised on the marquee that they would stop the film and the audience could listen to Amos and Andy on the radio, and then they'd resume the picture. And sure enough, you're sitting in the theater watching the movie, all of a sudden, bang, the movie stops, the light goes up, the manager wheels out one of these big console radios, says, time for Amos and Andy, turn it on. And the people in the audience would sit and listen to Amos and Andy for 15 minutes. And when it was over, he pulled the plug, pushed the radio off, and the picture resumed. They were so popular that you could walk down a city street in those days before air conditioning, any block. People were sitting on the porch. People had their windows open with the screens on them. And you could hear Amos and Andy from house to house as you were walking. As you were late for home, you could listen to the show while you were going house to house. They tell me that the telephone usage dropped by 50% whenever Amos and Andy was on the radio. And the legend is that when the show ended, the demand for plumbing facilities was incredible. Everybody waited to go until Amos and Andy got off the air. All-time favorites.
7 million. 8 million, 10 million.
Is I blue till everybody say, Andy, what are you thinking over there, son?
Well, Amos, now that we is in New York, I'm going into broker business. I figure on the money I gonna make here. I'm counting on being another J. Ping Pong Morgan.
Well, I think Wall Street, Andy, is a little too high for us, son, but I tell you what, we ought to get some kind of job.
Yeah, that's right. We don't want to keep on nibbling on our savings here.
You know, I got the evening paper here. I think we could look into help wanted ads, Andy, and see what they got in there.
Yeah, give me that thing. Let me see here. Look at this news item here. You'd say we is exporting cheese to France and all the Frenchmen is happy about it.
Where do it say that, Andy?
Right here in this headline, look at there. Thousands cheer as Limburger arrives in Paris.
Amos and Andy, they were great. Everything was great. I loved them all, and I think that you did too. And it's a shame they're gone. Well, they're not exactly gone. We have a revival going that we've had on the air for 34 years. We broadcast, as you well know, every Saturday afternoon from 1 to 5 on WDCB. That's 90.9 FM. And now we are starting to add streaming audio to the internet website that we have, and you can listen to our program on demand anytime you want. If you have Windows Media Player on your computer, you can go to our website, which is nostalgiadigest.com, and click on Those Were the Days, the name of the show, and then click. You can listen to an archive program, an older program from our Those Were the Days history, or you can listen to last week's show. And last week's show will be there for 7 days, beginning on a Tuesday. And every Tuesday it changes, and so you can listen to it. And you can listen to an hour now, and then do something else, and then listen to 45 minutes later, and come back and go back and forth. So that's kind of, so we're bringing the good old days into the 21st century with some of this stuff, and it's nice. We hear from, we're live on WDCB.org every Saturday from 1 until 5 with our program, and we hear from people all over the country, and in Canada, and in England, and we heard from a military man in Afghanistan who said he was listening to our program. Not Saturday afternoon over there, it's early Sunday morning. Yeah. But it's so much pleasure to be able to hear about all of that stuff, to hear that people enjoying it outside of this area. So that's really wonderful. And our book does have interviews with people like Eve Arden and Edgar Bergen and Ken Carpenter and Art Linkletter and Agnes Moorehead, Harry Von Zell, Don Wilson, Jack Benny. Jack Benny was one of the very first people we ever interviewed. I can't believe I just started this radio show in May of 1970, and in September I was sitting across from Jack Benny talking with him about his career. It just is mind-boggling to me. A kid who laid on the floor in front of that radio and listened to all of this stuff. So I'm going to close it up with one last little sound, the way they might have closed, Ben Burney, the old maestro himself, might have closed up his show. And if anybody's interested in a copy of the book, we have some on sale here, and I'll be happy to sign it for you too. But listen to Ben Burney and dream a little bit more about those golden days of radio.
Au revoir. Pleasant dreams. Think of us when requesting your theme. Until the next time when possibly you all may tune in again. Keep the old maestro always in your scheme. Yowza, yowza, yowza. Au revoir. This is Ben Burney, ladies and gentlemen, and all the lads, wishing you a bit of pleasant dreams. May good luck and happiness, success, good health attend your scheme. And don't forget, should you ever send in your request, why, we'll sure try to do our best, yowza. Au revoir, upon cheerio, a bit of a sweet sweet, God bless you, and pleasant dreams.
And thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.